Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today it is the 24th of January. In today's concise update, we're looking at the continued Russian advances into Velyka Novosilka. There is some new footage from the center of that town. We're also going to look at really important updates in Andrivka, Pokrovsk, approaching the Dnipro, Donetsk Oblast border, as well as updates from Chasiv Yar, the Kharkiv region, and Kursk. We're going to show off by looking at some new proposals being considered within the Ukrainian military to entice 18 to 25-year-olds to enlist in their ranks. We're going to look at those proposals by the end of today's video. But let's zoom in and look at the course of fighting in Velyka Novosilka. Before I do that, though, please like and subscribe so we can grow the channel. Over here, you can see that the Russian forces have at the very least advanced another 1.5 square kilometers, including everything that is east of the Kashlach River that has been unfolding over the past couple of days and is now verified by all sources universally. Ukrainian sources also mapped this yesterday, and you could see that the Russians have been able to infiltrate into the center of the town, including the local school. You have even the soccer stadium over here and the higher duplexes and apartment buildings. And there's like this main road, Harnia Road, and this is where you have the larger structures. So the Russians advanced along this particular route, and they came through the specific highway that I've been mentioning a lot, the one that starts in Zolotaniva and then branches northwestwards into Velyka Novosilka, the one that the 5th Tank Brigade has been using extensively over the past couple of months in their armored assaults through here. And initially, they were sort of hitting a wall with the Ukrainians defending steadfastly in this region that's pretty close to the Shaitanka River that I'm going over with my cursor, or even further to the southeast with these trenches and warehouses. But eventually, they were able to break through along this specific route and have now been able to actually enter into numerous houses, both north and south of the Shaitanka River. At this point, there is not really a verified account of whether there are Ukrainian soldiers left south of the Shaitanka River. And if there are, then there's no way for them to reconnect with the main Ukrainian garrison, either in Velyka Novosilka proper or way further north on what would be considered the rear. So the Ukrainian soldiers that would be over here, either they were killed in battle or at some point they're going to be taken POW by Russian soldiers in these locations. And I would be estimating that it's a couple of dozen in this location just due to how far disconnected it is from the main Ukrainian garrisons. But it is an important area. It includes some warehouses, private residential regions, drugstore, local school. But the main theater of fighting, as I said, is in the center of the town, and that's where the Russian forces made their presence known with two videos. We're going to look at this one over here. This is from January 24th. The 5th Tank Brigade, they cleared out numerous houses in close quarters combat, including eliminating Ukrainian machine gunners and using grenade drops to target Ukrainian soldiers that were moving from house to house during the night, and actually raised the Wagner flag above one of the larger structures in this region. Of course, they also were using a drone to shoot overhead and show the entirety of Velyka Novosilka and what remains of it. For the most part, the structure, the skeletal structure of almost all the houses is still there. You could see that it's still standing. So the houses here weren't flattened, and that's a reflection of the fact that the Russians were able to push through over here and take it over very quickly. It was not a main focus of shelling over these past years and months. Really, the most significant damage that you see in this region is to villages southwards like Stormayorska. That's a region that really got targeted heavily. But that's because it was at the front line for like over half a year. And so that's understandable. When you look over here at Velyka Novosilka, the Ukrainians do have that advantage that at the very least, if they are trying to move from house to house, they have a lot of options that they can take cover within, including in the basements of those houses. But the bigger picture is the Russian forces have now consolidated control over these regions. This is also backed up with another video even further westwards showing Russian forces operating in these duplexes. And in terms of the maximum extent of the advance, it would be, let's measure it over here, 1.2 kilometers, which is important within a pretty concentrated region that is dense in relation to nearby villages. And what that means is that in theory, there is still this corridor of like 400 meters that the Ukrainians could use if they are still located in some of these private residential areas and this warehouse region. But in effect, just due to the nature of the fighting and the fact that the overhead view from the Russian drone footage indicates that a lot of these regions are clear. Of course, there could be some remnants that are hiding in basements, and then a frontline mapping can't really account for that because you don't have soldiers that are manning every single field and every single house at every single minute of the day. And so if there is a small group that tries to, let's say, try to reconnect with the rest of the Ukrainian garrison, that is something that's possible in isolated incidents. I can't really account for that with mapping a region red or blue. So hopefully you guys understand that. But in effect, it means that the remaining parts of the Ukrainian control over here would be in the northwest, including mainly houses that are one story. And then this area that does include a couple of duplexes and an employment center. So that's where the main focus will be now for the Russian forces. And some Ukrainian sources are already talking about a complete withdrawal from Velyka Novosilka, although I believe that to be premature unless we begin to see footage over the coming nights where we actually do get proof of Ukrainians in droves now beginning to withdraw, because usually they try to move out during the nighttime. And now we're reaching that point in time when it comes to Ukrainian timing, because now it's nighttime in Ukraine and Russia. So they're going to have some attempts to withdraw. Largely, it's going to be in smaller groups, both because the garrisons that are remaining in Velyka Novosilka are pretty small, but also because there's no other choice doing so in large groups, as we've seen before with examples of 11 soldiers withdrawing at once. It was way too much of an abundance in one region, and then they get spotted even at night. But maybe the Ukrainians won't even have a choice, and in their haste to get out, they're not going to account for everything needed in order to create an evacuation scenario. But also, we're looking at them having to cross over a river, crossing over some tree lined regions and open fields, and advancing, say, 7-8 kilometers northwards before reaching some sort of reprieve region in these settlements that actually do contain basements in hardened houses. But we're going to see how that unfolds over the coming days now that we're reaching the final stages of the capture of Velyka Novosilka. And all in all, the battle did end relatively quickly with not that many casualties, I would say, on the Russian side because of the nature of the fighting. The Ukrainians were not really focused on deterring the Russians once they entered into the town. They were just focused on finding routes of escape and trying to hold out for as long as possible, not necessarily on inflicting casualties. Over here, you can see the Russian forces advanced north of Dakhnia, and they are now creating this envelopment scenario for the Ukrainians located in this village. It is a pretty large village, you could say, and it's one that sort of acts as a really important linchpin that holds the front line and maintains the Ukrainian forward connection. That also includes regions like open fields and tree lines, trenches also to the south. So that's why it's so important for the Ukrainians to retain control over Dakhnia. Losing control over it, which the Russians are trying to do, they tried to infiltrate directly into the southern part of the village, but were unsuccessful. They were repelled by the 46th Brigade. Here they captured to the north 1.4 kilometers through open areas. Losing Dakhne would then eventually precipitate the complete fall of the entire Dakhne pocket, which spans, let's say, 6-7 kilometers in width. That is a really, really important area that acts as a buffer zone. And there's a lot of Ukrainian units on the rear over there that are trying to prepare for that scenario by building up in Ulakli and in Andrivka. But they are really trying to buy as much time as possible because there has not been enough time to prepare for protracted fighting in Andrivka. It's just not that good when it comes to its geography. It's located on a low-lying river valley. The lack of trenches to the south or to the east of it, and just more generally, it was anticipated that in this point in time, Andrivka would be in a scenario where it's nearly enveloped on all three sides. You could see that from the north, from the east if the Russians approach it along this key highway, and also from the south. Moving northwards, we can see over here that the Russian forces captured additional open fields north of Yasnove. It amounts to 1.5 square kilometers of territory. And you can see this maneuver over here where in Novo Andrivka is pretty close to being completely encircled. There are likely several Ukrainian elements, probably just small groups that are operating in the northern part of this hamlet. But for the most part, it has been cleared of their presence. Most of the Ukrainian forces from the 151st Brigade are now in Sribny and in several other villages. And so, from a Ukrainian defensive perspective, it's going to be very important for them to try to isolate the available routes that the Russians have in order to attack, because the way in which the Russians were successful with Novoandrivka, and that's what's going to unfold over the coming days, we're going to capture this hamlet, is by not attacking directly, because you could see that it's pretty difficult, whether it's through armored forces or just attacking by foot, to advance through an area that is pretty concentrated, just one route, where the Ukrainians definitely can anticipate that and have a variety of drones in their arsenal to combat that, because that's the main way in which the Ukrainians are just repelling the Russian attacks over here. It is just due to their vast amount of FPV crews, and it's not necessarily due to the amount of infantry that are trying to push them back and forth fighting. And so now the goal for the Ukrainians is going to be to try to deny the Russians this opportunity to advance along this particular tree line south of Zribny and Zaporozhye, and also this northern flank, which runs along several tree lines. and then sort of force them to attack head on, wherein they can actually have a better chance head to head in holding out. But we'll have to see what ends up unfolding over there. Looking here to the north, you have this Russian advance that is pretty important because it is through a large swath of open fields south of Udachnya. It amounts to 2.3 square kilometers of territory captured. And it means the Russians are nearly at this local pond and some of these trails that connect to Novosilka. And by that point, you're reaching the Solona River and it's crossing into the Dnipro Oblast. So now the Russians are just very, very close. They're knocking on the door of reaching the border and the nearby anti-tank ditches. And this is an issue because the Russians are now establishing this sort of forward base that's pretty close to the border, which will make it difficult for Ukrainians in the vicinity, even if it's not that close to the border, to build up any sort of additional fortifications, meaning that a lot of the current construction that is going on, say 10 kilometers away, it's going to become very difficult to maintain. A Russian drone cruiser definitely ready to target any equipment, any bulldozers, any excavators, any troops that are out in the open building that. Not just that, but there's also mortars being moved closer to the front line. You could see them begin to pop up in an area like Toretsk and in the nearby hills. Of course, longer range artillery and attack helicopters, aviation. All of those means of firepower, they're going to be used at a much higher rate once the Russians are able to solidify control over Udachnya. And then it's going to be difficult for the Ukrainians to continue with their current construction along this sort of backup line that runs along the state border. So that's something to really keep in mind as we move forward. And also, this is a part of Russian efforts to not necessarily push through Odachny directly because the Ukrainian resistance over here is very heavy from the 32nd Mechanized Brigade, I believe. And you could also see the 155th Brigade operating around here. We'll get to them in a second. But looking at an option to flank it from the south. Also, around Kotlined, the Russians have advanced, and this includes the capture of 0.6 square kilometers of open fields. They are fighting near this local mine shaft, I believe it is, or just some other housing structure. They have not captured it yet. And now the Ukrainian resistance is focused on repelling Russian assaults towards the local coal mine facility. It is just a massive, massive plant. And it serves as a pretty good operating base for the Ukrainians. And now they're trying to turn it into an impregnable defensive node because besides this, there's nothing else in Odachny. There's nothing else that holds the Ukrainian line over here. You have this vast area that includes open fields that is on pretty high elevation. And there's not many roads here either, but the roads that are here, they can be used to attack towards Sohivka or towards the border. So it's very important for the Ukrainians to retain control over the sort of fabric of the front line, which includes this massive facility. And that's why the Ukrainian 155th Brigade is operating around here, conducting a lot of artillery shelling towards the Russian forces that were approaching on foot through fields and tree lines. So the 155th Brigade, we talked about them numerous times now, but it appears that some of the cohesion issues have been addressed. So they're trying to bring back all of the scattered formations and companies back together into a single centralized unit. And also, I always acknowledge that they do have a pretty strong artillery base because they were provided with a lot of that artillery equipment, including Caesars from the French side. And now they're beginning to use it. It's a different issue whether or not they're trained, but they definitely have the supply and the shells needed in order to fire it. Looking at the Toretsk front, as I zoom in, this is an interesting advance. We have the Russians gaining 0.8 square kilometers of territory south of Leonidivka. This is from the 6th Battalion of the 12th Azov National Guard Brigade. Their FPVs destroyed one Russian loaf, and that's interesting that they're using loafs this close to the front line. And also, it killed one Russian soldier with those strikes. And this just shows that the Russians are trying to chip away at some of these larger fortifications that are pretty strong and pretty difficult to assault head on, but they're trying to chip away at the ones that are sort of isolated from the rest of the Ukrainian garrisons because we're looking at an area that is pretty it's not really attached, you could say, because a lot of the Ukrainian resources and a lot of the forces have been moving northwards towards other villages that are closer to Kostantinivka, like Katerinivka, Klebanbik. And so areas like Shcherbanivka, Novospatske, Lunidivka, they have not entirely fell into Russian hands yet, but it's just difficult to center anything around there because of the nature of the fighting over there. So that is just a minor advance to keep in mind. And also, Russians are renewing now their attempts at pushing out the Ukrainians entirely from the Zabalka micro district. And the Ukrainians from the 53rd Mechanized Brigade, they're the ones that are primarily resisting this. They've been conducting FPV strikes onto advancing Russian soldiers. And this is the final bastion of Zabalka that is remaining. And following a capture of this area, it would be very difficult for the Ukrainians to hold on to the remaining pocket over here. It's really outstretched, this pocket. And they're doing it for an obvious reason. They don't want to unite the fronts of Toretsk and Shcherbunivka together. It would give the Russians a really good operating base to push forwards towards Konstantinivka. But with these new pushes towards the Balka, it's only inevitable that eventually it will end up falling into Russian hands. When it comes to Chasiv Yar over here, you can see there's an advance of 0.6 square kilometers by the Russian side. This is based on a video of Russian soldiers from, I believe, the 4th Motorized Rifle Brigade overrunning dugouts near the Shevchenko micro district. And this is important because they've now reached this new area in southern Chasiv Yar. They're taking over some of the structures in the forested regions and establishing a base that could then be used to attack towards the remaining parts of Chasiv Yar that are more rural in nature, while the core of Chasiv Yar has sort of been isolated from the rest of the city and is now being attacked in individual sections. So, for instance, the southern part of the core is being attacked heavily right now. You have this video from the 24th Mechanized Brigade repelling 6 armored vehicles that the Russians were utilizing from the 98th VDV division. And they were attacking along this road, trying to enter back into the apartment complex, but they were pushed back. And a lot of the infantry that were located in the vehicles dismounted and were then targeted by FPV drones. So the 24th Brigade is still operating around here and inflicting losses on the Russians. But you can see how the core, including the refractory plant and these large apartment citadel regions, have been isolated, and a lot of the logistic routes are becoming tighter and tighter and more difficult to use on a daily basis. Moving northwards, I want to zoom in over here on this important Russian advance. It includes the capture of all of Tabaivka. So Tabaivka has been a Ukrainian holdout. A lot of small squads have been operating over there, and there was never a Russian emphasis on taking it over. And so the Ukrainians were able to hold out in an area that is really outstretched. Here you can see the Russians captured now 6 square kilometers of territory, closing in on the region that is south of Kislivka, and finally establishing a solid front line that could be used to then push even deeper, because there are a lot of open fields over here that the Russians are probably eyeing and hoping to take over in order to approach populated areas like Peshane and approach trench lines that are located to the east of the Oskil River line. And this is just one of those steps to try to eliminate some of these really redundant and really annoying, from a Russian perspective, pockets that have never really had that tension needed in order to clear them out. So this is just the latest example of that. And then over here in the Varichna front, the Russians have advanced another 6.1 square kilometers of territory, and now they're pretty close to isolating Zapadnya. This would be a massive gain for the Russian side, so we're going to look at it in more detail in the next video. But they've captured over here 2 really dense forested areas, and as a result, they've also cut off the P79 road here and have flanked Zapadnya from almost 3 directions. So they're really shaping the battlefield in a way that will make it conducive for direct assault on this village. And from there is not any other nearby Ukrainian position that could be used to project strength and push back the Russians. So the Russians would have a pretty solid base of operations to attack southwards along the highway towards other villages like Malo Shepkivka, and then eventually you reach the western parts of Kupiansk. So it really is a concerning development for the Ukrainian side, and they definitely do need to boost the number of battalions or even brigades that are operating on this front, because 1.5 thousand troops is definitely not enough in that sector. Looking at the Kursk region, we have a slight advance by the Russian forces. This time they were able to re-enter the village of Viktorovka based on a video that indicated an advance of 2 square kilometers. So the 82nd Brigade, they released a video of them targeting 4 Russian vehicles, including a lead tank and 3 other armored fighting vehicles. They were able to destroy them, and the Russians, as they were dismounting due to them reaching tree lines, reaching houses, or just having their vehicles disabled, there were large quantities of Russian soldiers dismounting in those assaults that were targeted by FPVs of the 82nd Brigade, but also by ATGM crews that were stationed in these populated areas. So the Russians have recently ramped up armored assaults in this region after a couple of weeks where it sort of died down. Over the past week, the assaults over here have been pretty intense. And now they're focusing not just north of Viktorovka, where the Ukrainians have been able to keep them at bay, but also south of it. So the Russians have now been confirmed at this road, and as a result, they've cut off this road at another point and advanced a maximum of 2 kilometers eastwards, severing the connection between Viktorovka and Nikolsky, as I said. Now the goal is going to be to actually establish a base within the houses, because they've not been able to do that yet, and from there expand and take over the entirety of these villages, which are pretty small, but the Ukrainian defensive tenacity over here is extremely, extremely large. Now, to finish off the video, I want to look at this proposal that's being considered by the Ukrainian side, because they are looking at the potential of lowering the mobilization age to lower than 25. But before that, they want to at least take a step to allow in those 18 to 25-year-old cohorts involuntarily. So they're trying to plan something that they're going to call an honest contract, where there are guarantees for good relations and communication between the unit commanders and the new recruits, a lot of financial incentives, and guarantees for good training. Now, if that actually ends up happening in reality, that's a totally different conversation, but it's all about the framing that they can sell to a lot of these younger Ukrainian men that so far have not been involved in the fighting. And it doesn't just apply to this younger cohort of people in that demographic, but it also applies to all Ukrainian men that were discharged from mobilization earlier on in the war, or had some sort of deferment that is justified and allowed them to get away with not mobilizing throughout the past 10 years, you can say. And so now they're being given these enticing offers, and that's going to be the first step to sort of just dip Ukraine's toes into seeing how it works with getting these younger troops into the front line. And it's going to be probably a part of a gradual process of then lowering the mobilization age. And this comes as both the Biden and Trump administrations probably would like to see that lowered. The Biden administration definitely did begin to exert pressure by the end of his term, and I don't know what Trump's official position on it is, but it is probably expected to be to actually pressure Ukraine to lower that age of mobilization. And so this is just the first round, I believe, in a more gradual measure. And perhaps it's just the Ukrainians testing the water to see if giving these sort of benefits is sufficient. And if it's not, then they'll end up doing it by force. But that's something that's only going to be solved with time. We'll see if that ends up happening. Also, according to Ukrainian MP Oleksiy Goncharenko, he says that he received information that operators of the Iris-T air defense system have been sent away from their air defense units to the front line as infantrymen. They're now being given that order to either be expelled from their air defense unit or to sign up and enlist in the front lines. And that would be totally antithetical to what Ukrainian General Staff claimed after one of my earlier videos, where we talked about how there were allegations that they were trying to get people that had Western training with specialized equipment like air defense systems to sign up instead of with their designated units they were trained for, to fight on the front line just as a regular infantryman. And if this were the case, then all the denials by the Ukrainian General Staff would be really inaccurate, and they would fall upon their face. It would be just a complete lie. And so I don't know if the allegations are true, and that's why we have to just bring it to light and see how the Ukrainian General Staff responds. But then the question is, if the trained operators are being moved away from the front line and they had all the experience with the Iris-Ts, then who's going to operate those Iris-Ts? One theory is it doesn't matter, and that the situation is so important for the Ukrainians that they are willing to risk there being a deficit of operators that are trained and experienced in order to send in additional men to fight along the line of contact. And then the other claim would be that there just aren't as many Iris-T systems intact now, and that some of them were damaged due to Russian strikes. So I don't know what's the truth. I think it's probably a combination of both. But that would help sort of back up the need for the 18 to 25-year-old cohorts to begin to get deployed, because the current 5,000 to 6,000 a month Ukrainian soldiers that are getting enlisted and beginning to fight on the front lines is definitely not sufficient. It probably needs to be tripled or quadrupled in order to reach similar levels as the Russian recruitment, and just even independent of that, in order to have enough men to currently sustain the sort of intensity of fighting. And just to finish off the video, I want to look at these interesting Ukrainian deep strikes that occurred last night. They used over 130 drones, long-range kamikaze drones, a lot of them locally produced in this assault. And you can see over here that in the Ryazan region, over 20 of them were deployed according to Russian sources, and a lot of them struck the Ryazan Rosneft oil refinery, the third largest oil refinery in all of Russia. The oil storage was hit in the attack, along with the railway loading rack and the hydro treater unit, which is used to remove impurities from the refined products. And this refinery processes on a daily basis 262,000 barrels. That is really large, and it's the third largest, as I said before, facility that the Russians have in the entire country. It's responsible for 5% of Russia's entire refining output. So now a large part of it has been temporarily placed on hold. There's a lot of damage to the storage units. A lot of these storage tubes that you can see over here, they're like 50 meters wide in diameter. So you can see that they were holding a large amount of either gasoline, diesel, or fuel, or fuel oil or jet fuel. All of that gets produced in this facility. So now it has incurred significant infrastructure damage. This comes in addition to Ukrainian strikes that occurred in the Bryansk region. You could see them over here. I'm zooming in on the Kremny L Microelectrics facility, which had damage incurred by its production line and also to the warehouses. So that's included 6 Ukrainian drones targeting it directly, leading to damage, as was reported on by the director of the facility. So this facility produces microchips that are very important for the Pantsir and S-500 missile systems, along with the Caliber cruise missiles. So that's all for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.